Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 26th of August of 2023. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. But before we start, I would like to discuss with you, to compare with you probably the most important question, and probably to get the answer to the most important question: when the Ukrainian greatest counter-offensive operation is going to be ended. Whether this offensive operation can be endless, or maybe tomorrow or the day after tomorrow the Ukrainians will be collapsed or the Russians will be collapsed. Basically, I believe that everybody wants to get an answer to a simple question: at what point currently the Ukrainians are, or the Russians? And to understand the situation, to get the answer to this question, we can compare the Ukrainian greatest counter-offensive operation with the Wagner assault operation of Artyomovsk and Vuhledar. Because basically these two operations, like when Wagners were storming Bakhmut and Artyomovsk, and when the Ukrainians started their greatest counter-offensive operations, these two operations are the same operations. They have a lot of common things. The only difference between these two operations is that Wagner offensive operation is, of course, a little bit smaller, maybe not even a little bit, but few times smaller in comparison with the Ukrainians. And the Ukrainian greatest counter-offensive operation is, let's call it Wagner offensive, but in multiple times bigger. What does it mean? First of all, let's remember one more time the Wagner offensive operation. And if you remember, when they just started in November and December and something like this, when the Yakovlevka, the small settlement, fell, and after that the Ukrainians got the access to Vuhledar, the Russians, Wagners, were operating on the very broad front line, starting from Kurdyumovka and ending in the vicinity of Vuhledar, in this area. This is exactly the front line that Wagners were operating on. Very big front line. The Wagners have a lot of forces. They managed to recruit a lot of prisoners during the October and September. And as soon as Wagner started, they were attacking the Ukrainians in Vuhledar, in Razdolovka, Sakin-Vantseti, Zaliznyanska, Vasyukovka. Wagners were pushing in Dubovo, Vasilievka, Paraskovivka. There were very fierce clashes in Opotny, Ivangrad, Atradovka, Kurdyumovka, Zaryanovka, Klishchiivka. Wagners were operating with significant number of forces, trying to encircle and to capture one small settlement by the name of Artyomovsk. But somewhere at March, we start receiving first updates that for some reason the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation took a decision to replace Wagners on the flanks. And for example, Vuhledar, Yakovlevka and Mykolaievka was the first area where Wagners were replaced by the Russian forces, by the forces of the Ministry of Defense. To be more precise, probably with 106th Air Assault Division or something like this. Somewhere in the April, we got another update that Ministry of Defense took a decision to replace Wagners on the south of Artyomovsk, and so on. And by the beginning of May, by the end of April, somewhere in the middle of April, Artyomovsk and the settlement itself was the only place where we could find Wagners, because the flanks on the south and on the north were under complete control of the Ministry of Defense. And we remember that situation. We remember a lot of rumors about these strikes, about the fight between Ministry of Defense and Wagners, when he was asking that, saying that Ministry of Defense wants to get his victory and so on. But if we analyze the entire situation, we understand that there was just one reason why the Ministry of Defense replaced Wagners on the flanks, and the reason is that the assault operation of Bakhmut took around 8 months, and during that period of time, Wagners had significant losses. Obviously, we're not talking about dead people, we're talking about wounded and so on, but the losses was heavy. And basically, by the April, Wagner, let's say by the first update, when the Ministry of Defense took a decision to replace their forces on the flanks, Wagner didn't have enough of manpower to control this big front line from Berestovo to Kurdyumovka. And that's why the military authorities of Russia took a decision to shorten the operational area of Wagner, and according to the standards, according to the number of forces that Wagner had at this or that point of time. And when due to significant losses of the storming city, at some point in the April, Wagners were replaced also in Paraskoviivka, Dubovo-Vasilievka, and they were operating just in Bakhmut. Not because of fights with the Ministry of Defense, but because of and due to the number of forces that Wagner's had by the end of April. Now let's talk about the Ukrainian greatest counteroffensive operation. For example, that operation that Ukrainian, as we call this operation greatest, started on the 4th of June, and the Ukrainians had a lot of waves of attacks, a lot of points of pressure. The Ukrainians were trying to develop their offensive operation in direction of Zhiribyanki, Petykhatki, Lugovo, and this area. The Ukrainians started and still try to penetrate the Russians' defense belt on the Bradley Square in the south of Orekhov. The third area where the Ukrainians were trying to develop their offensive operation and still try to do this is Vremivka tactical bridgehead. This already 3 directions. The fourth direction is Avdiivka. During June and July, we had a lot of updates about the Ukrainians' attempt to attack in direction of Oputne, Peska, Pervomayska, Krasnogorovka, with one purpose: to release Avdiivka and to maintain the bridgehead in the vicinity of the settlement and not to allow the Russians to encircle the city. And the final direction of Ukrainian attack was in the vicinity of Kurdyumovka, Avdiivka, Klishchiivka. So the Ukrainians launched 5 attacks upon 5 points of Russian defense belt. And let's say in the beginning of July, the Ukrainians completely stopped any attempts to attack in the vicinity of Zhiribyanki. Somewhere in the middle part of July, we stopped receiving any attempts from the Ukrainian side to attack in the vicinity of Avdiivka. The final operation was the battle for the forest belt between Veselaya, Krasnogorovka, and this area. By the beginning of August, the Ukrainians stopped any real attempts to attack in direction of Klishchiivka, Andreevka, Kurdyumovka, Zaryanovka, on this line in the vicinity of Artyomovsk. By the end of August, the Ukrainians completely stopped any attempts to attack in the vicinity of Vorozhaine. And by the end of August, by the 26th of August, there is just one direction where the Ukrainians still attack. And we are talking about Bradley Square and the south of Orekhov. Of course, we can say about operational regroupings, about getting reserves, about many blah 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 things. But currently, this is the same situation as with Wagner's on the flank, when during the clashes they had losses, and basically at some certain time they didn't have enough of forces to hold flanks, and they were replaced by the Ministry of Defense. But the only difference in this case, the Ukrainians don't have nothing. They don't have Polish forces that can come and replace the Ukrainians in the vicinity of Artyomovsk or in Zhiribyanki. They don't have anybody who can replace them, and the only thing they can do is to stop, because they lost the critical mass on this or that front line, and they can attack just in one direction. And currently, this is the direction of Orekhov. And if we compare the timeline and the situation and so on, basically Orekhov is something like Artyomovsk at the beginning of May, when everything was almost finished. So basically now Orekhov is the Artyomovsk of the 1st of May, when there were around 20 days before the settlement fell. And currently the same situation now. But we have just one question. There are also about 20 days left for battle of Zaporozhye, of the South Ukraine, of Ukraine, and we have just one question: whether the Ukrainians are able to capture this territory during the last 20 days of Ukrainian greatest counteroffensive operation or not. And the second question, whether the capturing and taking under control, let's say, of Robotine and Novopokrovka will give the Ukrainians the same benefits and the same results that Wagner's and Russia got during the Battle of Artyomovsk. If you ask my opinion, I'm telling you no, they will not get the same results, because the Russians left the Battle of Artyomovsk, they finished the Battle of Artyomovsk with completely ready, fully blooded, fully loaded Russian army. And when talking about the Ukrainians, even if they are able to capture the settlements, they will leave this phase of special military operation without armored vehicles, without tanks, without people, without manpower, without rounds, without anything, without F-16s, without almost nothing. These are completely two results of almost the same operations. And this is the reason why the Western countries are blaming Zaluzhny, Valery Zaluzhny, the head of Ukrainian army, by saying that he should have attacked just in one direction, to concentrate his power at one point. Let's say in Vremivka, in Artyomovsk, or let's say in Orekhov, but at one point. But Zaluzhny took a decision to stretch his forces and to create 5 waves of attacks, and he haven't managed to achieve success at any point. Of course, we can talk about some results on Vremivka tactical bridgehead, but yet it's just ruins, and there is no tactical or even operational benefits from these positions that Ukrainians probably will be forced to leave during the next half a year or something like this. Now let's move to Robotine. This is the analysis, and we see that Ukrainians tried to use the same tactics of Wagner's, but something went wrong. Now we're going to continue with Robotine. Today we got a lot of very interesting updates from this bridgehead. The Russians are saying that they continue counterattack the Ukrainians in Robotine, trying to force them to step back, to leave the central part of the settlement, the northern part of the settlement, and so on. But the Russians are not providing us any video or photo geolocations of that. When talking about the Ukrainians, we know that Ukrainians continue pushing, and we had updates. For example, we got these updates today that Ukrainians managed to reach this defense belt, and currently the Ukrainians control, maybe they're not controlling, but at least they have their infantry on this line right in front of Novopokrovka. And basically everything that behind them is without the territory that behind them without Russian troopers. And this gives the Ukrainians possibilities to demine this area and to develop these positions in their favor. Furthermore, we got those videos how the Russians were bombing the Ukrainians on this defense belt. We will not watch the videos till the end because of losses and killing people and killing soldiers by the FEP drone strikes. So 2 geolocated positions, 2 geolocated videos that confirms the Ukrainian presence in this area. Furthermore, important update. Today, today the Ukrainian sources also published 2 probably the most important videos that at least explained everything to me. The first one took place also somewhere in this area, and this is the video. We will not watch the video till the end, but basically the author of this video, the forces of 46th Brigade, claimed that on this video we can see the withdrawal of positions by the Russian forces, how they were trying to evacuate from the fields from this defense belt in direction of Novopokrovka. In a second, this drone will strike the Russian forces, and probably with very significant losses for the Russians, because as you can see there is a very big group of Russian soldiers and the drone attacked them right in center. So basically, according to that video, the Russians were heading to the south from this defense belt. They were trying to get as far as possible and then probably to turn to the west in direction of Novopokrovka. They were heading in this direction and the Ukrainian drone attacked them. So maybe nothing special, the Russians left this defense belt because of pressure of the Ukrainians or something like this. But a few hours later we got another video from another source, and according to author of this video, he claims that on this video we can see another withdrawal of Russian positions somewhere in the vicinity of Robotine Novopokrovka. On this video we see how the Russian infantry was moving a lot of soldiers along the road, and the Ukrainians had established a real fire control, artillery control over this road, and they were bombing and shelling the Russians during the retreat process massively. Significant losses, probably a lot of infantry at least were wounded. So this is the second video confirmation of Russian withdrawal their positions in direction of Novopokrovka or even further. So basically we can say that currently the Russians try to implement the same situation, the same story and the same operation as they managed to implement in the vicinity of Urozhaine. If you remember, a lot of sources were saying that the Russians are counter-attacking on Urozhaine, they captured the southern part, they forced the Ukrainians to step back to the northern one, and there are clashes in the gray zone in the central part. A lot of things just with one purpose: to give the Russian soldiers, the rear guard forces, time to secure the road before the main forces leave the territory. And as soon as the Russians completed evacuation from Urozhaine, they confirmed that that was an operation. They were trying to win some time. They were trying to win some time for the forces. We got a lot of videos how the Ukrainians were bombing the Russians on this road with the cluster rounds. And basically, we see the same situation in Robotine. From one side, the Russians are saying they're counterattacking and forcing the Ukrainians to step back. We have a lot of geolocated videos of destroyed Bradleys. Ukraine destroyed Bradleys, that Ukrainians are trying to send more forces to increase the pressure, the Russians control the roads and so on, but basically the forces are leaving the settlement. This settlement from Russian doctrine is useless. They don't need to control this area. The continuous defense of the settlement will increase probably multiple times the Russian losses if they continue controlling and trying to control the settlement. So now they started this operation to withdraw in direction of Novopokrovka. One more time. Most of the sources are saying that the Russians are counterattacking and trying to force the Ukrainians to step back from the northern part. But yet we haven't received even a single confirmation of Russian infantry in the northern part of the settlement. This is very important to understand. And one more time, this is the special operation to win some time, to withdraw these positions and to reduce the level of losses from the Russian forces. From the Ukrainian side, we got a lot of from the Russian side, we got a lot of updates about destroyed armored vehicles in the fields. We have the first confirmation, or not visible confirmation, of damaged strikers somewhere among the fields, among the trenches. We have the video of destroyed Ukrainian Kazakh who was heading to the south, light vehicle with infantry or probably with some munition, but he was destroyed with anti-tank missile. And we have the videos of bombings of shelling the Russian positions in the vicinity of Robotine that was made by the 46th Air Mobile Brigade, which also confirms that Ukrainians started checking and testing the Russians' defense belt in direction of the settlement by the name of Verbova, because the next step of the Ukrainian forces, if there going to be any next step, is going to be Verbova. But I'm not so sure that Ukrainians have enough of manpower to continue any offensive operation and any clashes in this area after Robotine and after Novopokrovka. Also today, there was a very interesting case in the vicinity of Orekhov. Both sides, either the Russians and the Ukrainians, published the same video, and both sides, either the Russians and the Ukrainians, claimed that they managed to shut down enemies Su-25. This video was published by the Ukrainians, and they reported that they shut down Su-25, and then the Russians a day after published the same video and claimed about the same situation, that they managed to shut down the Su-25. Very interesting situation, very difficult to understand whom the Su-25 belonged to. Anyway, the battle continues, but I'm not so sure that Ukrainians will be able to restore their forces very fast after the end of the battle of a small unknown village between Orekhov and Tokmak. The Russians reported that as a result of fierce clashes in this area during the previous 24 hours, the Ukrainians lost another 115 soldiers and 11 armored vehicles. When talking about the Vremivka tactical bridgehead, we see complete reduce of any activity on this bridgehead. Just artillery drills, just drone strikes, just bombings and shellings. For example, in this video, we see how the Russians making some reconnaissance operation, just regular checking, regular control above the city. They mentioned the Ukraine M113, and after they discovered, they made just a regular strike, nothing special. The Ukrainians from their side tried to evacuate the damaged equipment between the fields, because during the previous wave they sent a lot of armored vehicles that were destroyed or damaged, and most of them still the Ukrainians have possibilities to repair, because a lot of armored vehicles were just dropped by the infantry when the Ukrainians saw any artillery strikes on the fields that they were located. And now the Ukrainians tried to find a solution how to evacuate tanks, armored vehicles, light vehicles, then to repair them and to send back to an army. The Russians understand the situation, they control the fields and try to destroy as much as possible Ukrainian engineering equipment, because the Ukrainians don't have enough of these types of weapon like engineering equipment. For example, on this video we also see how the Russians discovered completely normal tank T-64 that was abandoned by the Ukrainians somewhere on the fields. The Russians also could evacuate the tank, but this tank was too close to the Ukrainian positions, and they took a decision to destroy, because it's better than to give the Ukrainians possibility to evacuate this armored vehicle. When talking about South Donetsk and Marinka area, today we got some updates, some sources, at least the Russians, we haven't received any confirmation of that from the Ukrainian side. The Russians mainly reported that Ukrainians made few attempts to make reconnaissance in combat in direction of Vladimirovka. I'm not saying that that was a real offensive operation, just few commandos and reconnaissance team were moving along the forest lines. The Russians discovered them, and as a result of artillery strike, the Ukrainians were forced to step back. Furthermore, the Russians published a very interesting video of how they managed to establish complete Lancet control over the roads that goes to Vuhledar. On this video we see how the Ukrainians were trying to redeploy their forces to Vuhledar, but that track was discovered by the Russians and destroyed as a result of Lancet strike. Very interesting video. We see that Ukrainians have their logistic possibilities are reducing almost every single day, not because of like a better weapon, but because of the fact that the Russians are able to produce a lot, and they're producing more and more Lancet every single day. Furthermore, there was another video how the Russians Lancet managed in the same area, probably the same squad, managed to discover the Ukrainian Caesar, and as a result, let's say a counter-artillery duel, the Russians managed to damage the Ukrainian Caesar of French production and to destroy this artillery system. Very like painful losses for the Ukrainian artillery system, for artillery forces on this bridgehead. And another video we got from Krasnogorovka. The Russians continue suppressing the Ukrainian anti-tank positions, drone positions, sniper positions, and so on. For example, on this video we see how the Russians, as a result of reconnaissance operation, managed to discover the Ukrainian anti-tank position, anti-tank equipment Stugna P, somewhere in the building in the vicinity in the central part of Krasnogorovka industrial zone. And as soon as the Russians managed to discover that anti-tank position, the Russians launched FVP drone, and that FVP drone basically destroyed that powerful and very powerful Ukrainian anti-tank weapon. When talking about Avdiivka, as we discussed, somewhere in July we stopped receiving any updates from the Ukrainian side about any attempts to counterattack. Currently there is just one side who attacks or counterattacks, and we're talking about the Russians. And today they published another video how they discovered and attacked the Ukrainian positions somewhere in the vicinity of industrial zone on the east of Avdiivka. Another episode of FEP drone strike against the Ukrainian position. Nothing special, no movements on the ground, no attempt to counterattack, and so on. When talking about Klishchiivka, the same situation. The sides completely stopped doing anything. Either the Russians and the Ukrainians don't have the critical mass to make significant, a very powerful offensive operation, but when talking, well, if we compare, the Ukrainians don't have manpower to do anything, but the Russians have some critical mass, some forces to develop their positions and to restore control over the territories and the hills, to be more precise, over the hill 205 in this area. And the Russians published the video of storming operation. There was a very long video, 4 minutes video, how the Russians were storming these trenches, these fortifications, that hill 205, and as a result of a small assault operation, the Russians managed to return control. That was a very funny video because there was lots of interesting cases, and if you're able to see the video, I suggest you to watch. There was a lot of cases at some points of time. Either the Russians and the Ukrainians were fighting against the Ukrainians because they didn't understand where they're located, and the Ukrainians didn't understand that they were with the Russians in the trenches, and both the Russians and the Ukrainians in the trenches saw the Ukrainian offensive forces, and together they started attacking the Ukrainians. So some small balagan on the north of Klishchiivka. When talking about Lyman and Kupyansk front lines, we continue receiving updates. There are still heavy clashes, artillery duels on Tarskoye salient. The Ukrainians published the video how they managed to discover the Russian tank and to destroy the tank as a result of artillery strike. And the Russians published the video how they discovered and destroyed the Ukrainian Stab B howitzer, maybe the howitzer that destroyed the tank that we just saw in the previous videos, who knows. But anyway, we also see that the front lines in this area, the combat lines in this area, are static. Neither the Russians nor the Ukrainians are making any attempts to attack, counterattack, and so on. Everybody expect and wait the end of Battle of Robotine, the Kursk of 2023. Now we're moving to the Kupyansk front line. Probably the Ukrainians analyzed the risk. They found a solution with this bridgehead. They brought some drone squads, and today the Ukrainians published the video, some geolocated confirmation that they managed to establish some fire control over the supply roads that goes from Svatovo to Raigorodka to the Russian bridgehead on the Ukrainian side of Zherebets River. At least we had two geolocated strikes against the Russians' armored vehicles that were heading in direction of the combat line and probably were trying to support their forces on the edge. When talking about Kupyansk, nothing happens there. Static situation. The Minister of Defense reported about some offensive operation, that the Russians managed to improve their positions on the edge, that the entire losses on the Kupyansk and Lyman were around 110 soldiers. We got just one geolocated video how the Russians managed to destroy another Ukrainian howitzer Paladin M109 as a result of counter-artillery duels. So as you can see, that we have now just one combat line, just one important battle, and we are talking about the Battle of Robotine. On the Kherson, the same situation, just regular counter-attacks, counter-artillery duels, and so something like this. But today we got also very important update from Sumy region. For example, some Russian sources started speculating or probably spreading some real updates that today, in the vicinity of Sumy, was discovered something like fighting between Russian commanders' reconnaissance team and Ukrainian forces. And when talking about Sumy region, this is not the first attempt of the Russian side to send some reconnaissance team in this area. If we increase the number of updates since the beginning of August, we had at least 3 confirmed cases of Russian reconnaissance team in this area. This was the first one, took place in the beginning of August, how the Russian reconnaissance team entered the checkpoint stronghold of Ukrainians, and as a result of very fast attack, they destroyed the entire Ukrainian position. Another operation took place a little bit to the north, and currently we got another update about the clashes in the vicinity of Sumy. Furthermore, the Ukrainian sources reported today that they were forced to redeploy the forces of 30th Jaeger Brigade in the vicinity of Kupyansk as close as possible to possible area of Russian offensive operation, because more and more sources are saying of upcoming Russian greatest offensive operation, and some activity of Russian reconnaissance team in Sumy tells me or confirms that probably this region is going to be the area where the Russians will try to attack as much as deep as possible in direction of Dnipro and Kiev, and some forces probably will try to encircle Kharkiv from the north and from the west. And that's it for today. Military Summer channel reminds you to condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.